series that spans 30 years, what was left out, in our opinion, was much less significant than what was included.
Your presence there during all of this in a pretty small community, do you think you in any way influenced events by actually being there and recording them and being so close to the Avery family?
I mean, I think as a documentarian, you always have that question, just your literal presence, the presence of a camera, does that change what's going on? But we were very careful. Laura has a law background. We knew this was a pending case. We never asked people about the facts of the case. We were there to document people's experiences. And, I would argue that we had much less of an impact on anything that was going on than any other member of the media or journalist who was there, who was playing a very active role in the case.
Yes, because it certainly comes across in the series that the media did play a big role. What was your view of the role they did play?
It was an education for me, actually. As Moira said, I have a legal background, and I understood that the media were a force on the American criminal justice system, but I always thought of them as an external force. And
Positive or negative force?
Possibly neutral. Going in, at least, that's what I thought. But as Moira said, this was a high-profile case, so there was a lot of media attention on events and individuals, and there was a lot of trying to chase people down or trying to chase things down, and digging into Stephen's background and just trying to paint a picture of this person, paint a picture of the accused. And I understand that. To a certain extent, we were doing that as well. What I find disturbing in a way is the lack of recognition I think the media had about how much of an internal force they were on the process, because what we saw happening was there were, public press conferences that the prosecution would have, for instance, in front of televised news media, and then those would be channeled and, broadcast in the community. And this was a community where Stephen and later Brendan Dassey had a right to draw a jury pool or draw from a jury pool. And so that amount of exposure and the amount of detail that the prosecutor was getting into in these press conferences, I believe ensured that these individuals were really going to have a hard time impaneling an impartial jury.
And what do you make of the reaction, both the positive and negative, the petitions calling for Steven Avery to be exonerated, those on the other side in the prosecution attacking you for what they say is selective use of facts?
We're encouraged by the dialogue. If there is going to be any change in our system for the better, then people need to understand and identify the problems and try to engage in, a meaningful way to change them.
Do you think this will change the system?
I think it already has. I think public understanding of false confessions was very much lagged the facts. It's very counterintuitive that a person would confess to a crime they didn't commit. And I hear from practitioners already that the starting point of the argument that perhaps this is a false confession, the concept is already conceivable.
And we heard there from Laura Ricciardi and Moira Demos, the makers of Making a Murderer. And that brings us to an end of this edition of NewsHour. From me, James Kamarasamy, and the rest of the team here in London, thanks very much for listening. Goodbye.
This is WNYC, FM, HD, and AM, New York. Just keep listening.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone, and I don't think it's going way out on a limb to start off today by saying that after the votes in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, the only way the Republican Party can stop Donald Trump from being its presidential nominee is probably if Ted Cruz drops out of the race very soon, and that doesn't look likely. Listen to these key lines from the Saturday night speeches when the results came in. First, Trump, making perhaps a reasonable claim at this point, to be seen as a movement leader.
Time magazine last week did an incredible cover story. They said It's a movement, and that's what it is. It's an incredible movement with incredible people. Incredible people.
Here is Ted Cruz circling the wagons around only the most traditionally conservative of Republican voters.
Indeed, the screaming you hear now from across the Potomac is the Washington cartel in full terror that the conservative grassroots are rising up.
And Rubio billing himself as the candidate of a new conservative coalition. This one's really interesting and kind of different. So here's a minute of it with the applause edited out for time.
If you are watching tonight and you are that father that works 2 jobs so that your kids could have all the chances you never did, in the 21st century, we conservatives will fight for you. If you're the 17-year-old high school student who wants a big future, and so you get up well before dawn to take 2 buses to a better school halfway across town, who gets home late at night to do homework because you know that God has made you for more than what people around you tell you you are made for. In the 21st century, we conservatives will fight for you. We will fight for you because we come from where you are now, because we live the way you live now. And we know that limited government and free enterprise and a strong national defense is a better way forward for you, for me, for us, and for the United States of America.
A generational appeal from Marco Rubio. So again, I don't think it's going way out on a limb to start off today by saying that after the votes in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, as reflected by those clips, the only way the Republican Party can stop Donald Trump from being its presidential nominee is probably if Ted Cruz drops out of the race very soon, and that doesn't look likely. Joining us now, with that as enough of a preamble, for my first guests today, Andy Shane, political reporter from The State, the leading newspaper in South Carolina, and Washington Post national political correspondent Karen Tumulty. We have Tumulty, and we certainly have tumult, at least on the Republican side. Hi, Karen. Welcome back.
Great to be here.
And hi, Andy. Welcome to WNYC.
Thank you for having me today.
So, Karen, I'm just jumping headlong into the horse race here, which is not what we do on this program every day, but I think this is one of those moments. How much do you agree with the premise that unifying behind Marco Rubio and fast is the only path for Republicans to stopping a Trump nomination?
You know, and I am not even sure that would work because you take a look at these March 1st states, you know, one of which, the biggest of which is Texas, and it is really hard to see that unifying behind Marco Rubio would do anything more than probably, you know, solidify support for Ted Cruz. So I'm not sure even that would work, but with Texas coming up, it's hard to see Cruz feeling much pressure to get out of the race.
Andy, one of the things from the South Carolina exit polls that leads me to believe the only Rubio theory is that 74% of the Republican voters Saturday described themselves as evangelical, and yet Trump beat Cruz by more than 10 points. Rubio beat Cruz handily for second among non-evangelicals. The rest of the country isn't as evangelical as South Carolina. So there are the outlines of the race going forward, I think. So as a watcher of South Carolina politics, are those the numbers you've seen, and how revealing do you find them to be?
Well, you know, as you mentioned, the rest of the country is not as evangelical as South Carolina or as the South, but the real issue is, you know, look at the New Hampshire exit polls for Donald Trump. Of course, a state where, you know, 1 out of 5 voters was evangelical, whereas 3 out of 5 voters here in South Carolina are evangelical. I mean, he was winning across the board. He had a cross-the-board support with conservatives. I remember even in one of the exit polls, he was the favorite among folks who owned guns and people who don't own guns. You know, part of the inevitability theme that seems to be coming up is where do you get to Trump? Where do you find that weak point? Because he is there's been record turnout in the first 3 primaries. He's drawing out new voters. These are voters, who have felt really disenfranchised from the system, from Washington, D.C. And just as a quick example, I quoted a woman in my story on Sunday who's voted for president 3 times. She's voted for John F. Kennedy, she voted for Hillary Clinton in 2008, and she voted for Donald Trump. And I think that is that what's going to happen on Super Tuesdays, that you're going to see a lot more of these voters who have been on the sidelines come off the sidelines because they like Trump.
And education, Karen, seems to be a really major factor for Trump. Half the Saturday voters were not college educated, and Trump won them decisively. He beat Cruz easily among non-college educated evangelicals, which means education was a more predictive demographic than conservative religious values for evangelicals themselves. Do you see those numbers as significant?
I do, because, if you look at the makeup of the Republican primary electorate, and again, if you especially looking at it as the race moves south where it's going, the fact that he is winning this demographic seems to tell everything.
Karen, why do non-college educated Republicans find Trump especially appealing?
Oddly enough, I see a real thread in some ways between his voters and Bernie Sanders's in the Democratic primary. These are people who basically feel like they've been shafted by the system, and they like the idea, I think, that somebody is standing up and speaking for them, yelling for them, if that's what it takes. These are people who feel like they've played by the rules, they've done what they should do, and everywhere they turn, they see life is not getting better for them as it has for every other generation in this country. That not only are they living a lower standard of living than their parents did, but that their kids are likely to end up living in a lower standard of living even still. And they blame it on a whole lot of things, including an influx of immigrants. But they are people, I think, who largely feel very, very frustrated.
Getting a little more into the data reads, Andy, Cruz beat Trump by 10 points among voters describing themselves as very conservative, who are, I see, a larger share of the electorate than in 2012 in South Carolina, so that's interesting. More self-described very conservative voters this year in an already very conservative state, but it wasn't nearly enough to win, and that was his only dominant group. Trump actually beat Cruz among non-college educated evangelicals, as we said, who should have been among Cruz's core supporters, yes?
Exactly. I mean, it's not even just non-college evangelicals as a group. I mean, it used to be that in the South and in South Carolina, people thought of evangelicals as one big block. They go to Santorum, they go to Huckabee, they went to Pat Robertson back in the day. So, but now I think that just like everything else, there's a fragmentation among the evangelicals. I think based on obviously on economy, on their how much they make and on their education. And so you probably we saw that higher educated, wealthier evangelicals tended to go more towards Cruz and Rubio, while those that were less educated, made less money, really went towards Trump. And it's part, as Karen was saying, it's part of that appeal that I feel like I've been left behind there. Yes, there's an economic recovery, but am I feeling it? Am I really a part of it? I don't feel like I'm making more money than I did a decade ago. And to a certain degree, getting back to the evangelicals, and again, the logic is that Donald Trump didn't come into this campaign wearing his religious bona fides on his sleeve like Ted Cruz did. But of course, he has been on the campaign trail touting that. And what I hear from religious leaders, and even those who emphasize this within the Republican Party, is that evangelicals are willing to sit here and vote for someone who may not necessarily represent all of their values if he ends up protecting their values. So again, it's almost like hiring, the schoolyard bully to help protect you from another bully, because you want to make sure your religious freedoms are protected. You want to make sure that your wishes on pro-life and on maybe trying to overturn same-sex marriage might be an issue that hopefully he'll tackle if elected.
Listeners, your comments or questions on the results in Nevada and South Carolina on Saturday. We'll get to the Democrats, and of course, Andy Shane from The State, the biggest newspaper in South Carolina, will be able to give us some analysis of the Democrats because they just flipped states now. They switched places. The Democrats come to South Carolina for next Saturday. The Republicans are in Nevada now for the Republican caucus, which is tomorrow. But listeners, your reactions or questions about either vote Nevada or South Carolina on Saturday, 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692 for Andy Shane from The State and Karen Tumulty, national political correspondent for The Washington Post. And Karen, I'm gonna keep hammering this scenario for one more question. And I hear what you said before, that even if Republicans unify soon behind Marco Rubio, that may not be enough to stop Trump at this point. But on the question of Rubio or Cruz, if they were going to unite behind somebody, Cruz's support is narrow, conservative evangelicals, and a little bit deep enough to give him 22% on Saturday. Rubio's support is kind of shallow in all groups, but much more broad. Some conservatives like him, some moderates like him, some evangelicals like him. He does talk the God talk. Some national security voters like him. So here we go again. If Rubio were to drop out, his coalition goes as much to Trump as to Cruz, I think. But if Cruz drops out, his coalition tends to go to Rubio. Karen, how much evidence do you think there is for that?
Well, I think that looking at it as coalitions doesn't even apply this year either, because again, you look at the fact that Ted Cruz didn't do so well in South Carolina, even though it's the epicenter of evangelicalism. I think the only thing that can really get people to rally behind Marco Rubio at this point is that if Republicans suddenly go back to caring about what they have always ended up caring about, which is electability. If somehow the party can suddenly stop looking at, this week and next month and start looking at November and, who would be the best contrast for them on a debate stage against Hillary Clinton, that's when Marco Rubio, I think, could gain some traction. But, he's been making that argument. His supporters have been making that argument all along, and the Republican base just doesn't seem to care.
Let me play another Rubio clip from his speech after the results came in on Saturday night that in its way seems to argue the case that you just made, which is that he would be best positioned in a diverse America in 2016 to go up against Hillary Clinton. Here is a minute of Marco Rubio.
My friends, the 21st century conservatives are the son of a single mother who grew up in poverty and was almost lost. And today he serves this state as its junior senator, Tim Scott. The 21st century conservative movement is the daughter of immigrants from India who wanted desperately for their children to have all the opportunities they never did, who faced a string of prejudice, and yet because of the greatness of our country today, Nikki Haley is the governor of a state where it's always a great day. And the 21st century conservative movement is the son of a bartender and a maid from Cuba, who tonight stands one step closer to being the 45th president of the United States of America.
So Andy Shane, the state in South Carolina, how much was it factor that Rubio doing as well as he did on Saturday?
I think a few things helped Rubio on Saturday. There were 11 days between what happened in New Hampshire and South Carolina. I think that helped Rubio a great deal. Normally there's been, a week or even less between these primaries, and we had a fairly large break between, the Chris Christie fight at the debate, and then of course his fifth place finish in New Hampshire and what happened in South Carolina. He owned up to it. I mean, that was I talked to a voter who was choosing at one point between Cruz and Trump, and went with Rubio because he owned up to what happened in New Hampshire, and she really appreciated that. And he said, I'm going to do better. I'm going to fight better, and it really that really impressed her. And I think that impressed a lot of people in South Carolina. I also think that people realized that Jeb Bush's campaign well, it's not going to go much farther than South Carolina. So I would say that a lot of his supporters went with Rubio and helped bring his numbers up as well. So even as, of course, the candidates have been fighting with each other, they obviously are in that same establishment camp, and I think that helped Marco with a obviously better than expected finish in South Carolina. He'd been coming into the state with the third place choice behind Cruz. Cruz was a pretty solid second behind Trump. And the other thing that Marco Rubio did was in addition to sort of own up to what happened in New Hampshire and sort of again sell himself as the anti-Trump alternative, he also hit on those evangelical voters. And I think there was sort of an underpinning of concern even among some evangelical voters about Ted Cruz and what had happened in Iowa with Ben Carson and with the mailing with the mailer about the
voter violation. Yeah,
the voter violation.
Cruz dirty tricks.
Exactly. So was Ted Cruz talking out of both sides of his mouth?
Which I gather, by the way, tell me if this is true, I heard one report, continued in South Carolina with Cruz people sending robocalls in Spanish to people who were probably white saying vote for Rubio, with the intent being that, white people who'd be alienated by a robocall in Spanish, if they associated Rubio with that, they'd go for somebody else. Did that happen?
It's tough to say. I mean, South Carolina. I saw someone tweet, someone who knows a good thing about South Carolina politics, who said, part of maybe what happened this time was that the campaigns were making up things. I hear that someone is getting a robocall, and we have several reports, but we were never able to nail something down. And my favorite was, I got a call from a campaign about a robocall and told me to call one of their supporters, and this person said, you know what? I can't tell you where I got the phone call from. I get so many phone calls with polls and from the candidates and from the super PACs that he wasn't able to pinpoint this phone call to to where it came from on his caller ID. And I think in the end, I'm not sure that matters as much anymore as the fact that you have things on social media. You have you can watch a lot of this now on TV live with of course MSNBC and CNN and Fox and all the rest of it. And to a certain degree, you're talking about two sons of Cuban immigrants, and in the end, for Rubio to sit here, for Cruz to sit here and be critical of what Rubio might do and vice versa, it seems a little bit comical in a way. And I think one thing to take away from this is that half the voters in South Carolina, half the Republican voters in South Carolina, voted for two sons of Cuban immigrants and an African American. And it does go to show you that diversity that has been growing within the party and the acceptance of that to a certain degree, even though, there might be those who would argue, on the other hand, that the state favored Donald Trump, and of course he's, some of his appeal to folks is some of the xenophobic comments that he's made.
The Democratic vote in South Carolina next Saturday is expected to be 50% or more cast by African Americans. Andy, what percentage of the electorate was anything but white for the Republicans on Saturday?
No, a sliver. I mean, there was a lot of talk about how in New Hampshire there was some crossover among independents and Democrats for Donald Trump. Because we have our primary separated, you can only vote in one. In a year when there's usually two of them, Democrats will stick to Democrats, Republicans will stick to Republicans, and then you are vying for some independents who may go on either way. But I don't think that's not a very large group.
So a sliver non-white, you're saying. And so, Karen, it makes me wonder about this rainbow strut in the Rubio lane. Rubio with Governor Nikki Haley, Indian American, and Senator Tim Scott, African American, who endorsed him. There are always a few people of color in Republican leadership positions, one here, one there. But I'm skeptical of the media narrative that the Rubio, Scott, and Haley show represents the new face of the Republican Party. I think it's just a coincidence that two of them are from South Carolina, and so there was Rubio with them for a few days, and they had a great stage for a moment. But the National Republican Party is so white, and it's devoted and committed, and some would say stuck on the interests that divide whites from people of color generally in this country. And the coalition we saw this week perhaps means almost nothing in the big picture, even though Rubio loves this idea of running on it. How much do you agree with my analysis?
Well, it's true, and I think probably more so right after the 2012 election. Don't forget, it became almost conventional wisdom that immigration overhaul was going to have to pass because the Republican Party could not continue to survive with the small sliver of the Latino vote that it had. Well, it turned out that the opposite happened. The Republicans put together this gigantic autopsy report where they talked about the need to increase their, appeal to people who are not white and are not old. Well, then Donald Trump is now sweeping the primaries with the exact opposite message. So I think that a lot of the party leadership, it's like you can't even talk about the Republican establishment anymore. I don't even know if they exist anymore. But what used to be the Republican establishment had a very clear sense of what it was going to take for this party to survive in decades going forward, at least on a presidential level. They're actually doing fairly well, quite well, on the congressional and on the state house level. But as a presidential party, everyone recognizes they need to broaden their appeal, and so instead we have Donald Trump.
Chuck in Poughkeepsie, you're on WNYC. Hi, Chuck.
Good morning. You're speaking to us South Carolinians. I lived there for about 18 years.
Oh, good.
So I know the politics there, and I would say to you, in the immediate sense, I would like for you guys to give some definition to who is an evangelical. You never define that term because the way it's being used is as if you're talking about another human being from another planet. It's not the way it's supposed to be. Secondly, blacks and whites separate at the margin. We are the one who should be anger. But the so-called derived anger that you guys are throwing around, it's not real. It's like the Tea Party when they came in. If the poor whites, and believe me, there are more poor whites in South Carolina than there are black. If the poor whites really are concerned about the materialism that exists there, they would be hugging President Obama because the healthcare system there in South Carolina is terrible. And for the first time, many relatives and friends that I graduated with, they have healthcare. So I think the whole theater that you guys are attempting to describe with your nouns and your verbs needs to be looked at more closely politically. It's just not what you're saying. There's something else going on.
So what do you think is going on, Chuck?
Well, number one, the same forces that drove South Carolina, and when Ronald Reagan came through there and gave his own definition of what should happen to get that vote, he, Trump, and Rubio are doing the same identical thing. If you look at, for example, if you look at the way Rubio talked in closing out his campaign in South Carolina, you would think that he's Barack Obama, except he doesn't use the word change. So, there is a lot of confusion there, but I'm saying the terms that you're using to describe this political atmosphere needs more need more definition than what you guys are giving it.
Chuck, how would you describe or define an evangelical voter if you think we're not doing a good job of it?
Well, for example, the word evangelical is used by the press, but there is not one time except when the Pope made a general statement about the bridge and the wall with regard to Donald Trump. And you see even some of the Protestant ministers jumped on the Pope because he made that biblical statement. That's not from an evangelical.
Not only in Washington, but around this country.
To say, but I mean Donald Trump used that because he knew that the people to whom he is addressing, they have no sense of what an evangelical really is.
And Chuck, I'm going to give it to Andy Shane to react. Chuck.
Strong issue for people in that state. Can you wrestle with that one for us?
Well, I think it's related back to what Don was saying. It's anger, and let me, explain how you can say things that you think would insult a core group, but enough of them will buy into you. So as Dick pointed out, he is not an evangelical on policy, but most people don't know policy, don't look at policy. At his rally on Saturday night, he was standing up saying, when I'm president, we're going to say Merry Christmas everywhere, and the crowd went wild. That's enough of a signal that, okay, he's not perfect, but, we'll support him. And a lot of the blue-collar people who are going to turn out for the Republican primary, if they're religious, are more likely to identify as evangelical. So they're, as was pointed out, they are voting class a lot. They just happen to be evangelical when they turn out. And if he hits that minimum bar, they get to vote for this guy who's, seemingly saying outrageous things, but that's what they think is needed. He comes down, and yes, he insulted John McCain, who did very well down here. But, the same thing happened in 2000. In 2000, John McCain was running against George W. Bush for the nomination, and there were two whisper campaigns just destroying John McCain, and they succeeded. One of them was that, hey, he's the Manchurian candidate. He was a POW, and so he was brainwashed. He can't be trusted as president. And the other was showing a grainy photo of him holding a darker-skinned child, saying, did you know John McCain had a black baby? Of course, he has an adoptive daughter from, I believe, Bangladesh. So, it was okay for W. Bush to destroy a veteran because he said he's going to make America strong again, and the same thing is happening here. Donald Trump can diss John McCain and then turn and say, I'm going to make the American military stronger than it's ever been, and he taps into that anger, and it's seemingly okay.
Go ahead, Dick.
Yeah, let me just add one other quick thing about Trump that we haven't hit on, and I think our other guests would probably agree with this, is that, he it's also the way he communicates. He doesn't talk in political talk. He doesn't have that kind of grammar. He doesn't get up there and say, when I am president, I promise to X. He's got his whole verbal patter is sort of drawn from reality television, and they know him as a reality TV star, and so he's breaking all the rules of political talk. And for people who are really upset with politics per se, that's extremely appealing. You can hear it in the visceral reaction. So I think it gives him, for better or worse, it gives him license to smash the China.
John, let me go back to you and the fact that Jeb Bush called it quits on Friday. This was he was never really able to have any traction this go round. He brought his mother in, he brought his brother into South Carolina. What do you make of the fact that Jeb Bush just never was able to find support within the Republican Party? I think his supporters, or perhaps his team as well, spent something like $150 million. I think I have that right, and less than 100,000 votes that he got. So what should we make of Jeb?
Well, I think there's two problems. One is money doesn't matter as much in presidential elections as people think they do. They're really important in down ballot races, Senate races, congressional races, but people get to see the candidates so much that being able to spend money isn't what it used to be. You get to still know the candidate. Second of all, I tweeted something last week about Jeb saying that campaigning with W, I think just reinforces for everybody the reasons they're not voting for Jeb. And I got more retweets on that than anything I've ever tweeted, I think, in my life, with people in agreement. The point is, I think it was a strategic mistake. First of all, it reminded people, do we really want another Bush? It just had this sort of empire dynasty feel to it, which was not a good card for Jeb to play. Second of all, people kept looking at it and saying, wow, there's George Bush. He looks really enthusiastic, energetic, and so forth. And then Jeb would come up, and it wasn't the same. And so I think those two factors together were certainly a Hail Mary, in a sense, by the Bush campaign. But I think, if anything, it probably backfired and hurt him in the end.
And Scott, I have to say, as someone who, obsessively watches all this stuff, I'm not exactly sure why sometimes, but I have to say that Jeb Bush, he just never looked like he was enjoying himself or that he was 100% committed to running for the White House.
Right. Well, he, and of course that was tapped into early on by Trump who labeled him low energy.
That's right.
And, you know, that kind of insult stuck because it seemed to have a little bit of truth in it. He seemed exasperated that the voter wasn't getting the fact that he was the best person for the job. You know, here he is running on saying, I know policy, I know these things the best, but he's not tapping into people's anger. He's trying to seem like the anti-Trump in a selection cycle where the angry Trump is exactly what people want. And John's absolutely right. When you are trying to win an election in a cycle that is anti-establishment, when your last name is Bush, that's tough enough. But the last thing you should do is bring in your brother, who exemplifies the Republican establishment as the last Republican president. It was, the action of somebody who's desperate, but it had no chance of working because it played into what everybody was essentially mad at to begin with.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
I was going to say about the timing. I'm talking about the wrong candidate for the wrong year. Jeff's timing really started to go wrong in 1994 when he lost his gubernatorial race in Florida. And his brother was running in Texas, and he was expected to lose, and Jeb was expected to win. Instead, the reverse happened. Jeb was expected to win, and he was the smart one, right? And then he was going to, be set up to run once Bill Clinton got out of office, and it didn't happen that way. And so by the time he got around to it, he hit the wrong year. And I think that, he was too polite. He was too polite for this cycle. I see these interviews where these voters say, I can't really go for Jeb. I just don't see the fire. I just wish he had showed more fire, because again, it's that visceral feeling they had.
And that's Dick Pullman, who joins us along with John Brabender and Scott Huffman. We're talking about what happened this past weekend, the GOP South Carolina presidential primary and the Democratic Nevada caucuses. Hillary Clinton winning in Nevada and Donald Trump winning in South Carolina. 1-888-477-9499. Dick, I have an email from Roy who says, I can't let the comment by Pullman stand that Clinton won the Hispanic vote in Nevada when the polling shows different. And I've seen some mixed, I think, polling on this. He linked to a Washington Post piece.
Yeah, and the New York Times had a good analysis over the weekend that was wrong, that's wrong in the exit polls. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense that Bernie wins the Hispanic vote by eight points, is what the exit poll said. And the New York Times had a really good analysis where they actually went in and they looked neighborhood by neighborhood in the heaviest precincts in Clark County, which is Las Vegas, the heaviest Hispanic neighborhoods, and they were pulling out Hillary getting more than 60% of those voters. And they have a long analysis, which we don't need to get into on the radio, about how the exit poll system was not really set up to sample such a small number of Hispanics. It was something like 200 that they sampled. So, I think the fact that she won the non-white vote, I think is kind of speaks for itself, and I think it's going to set her up well for down the road.
A tweet from Walt said,
there's one other thing about Nevada is it's really about organization. I mean, the biggest difference between her campaign and Bernie Sanders is his is a movement, hers is a campaign. And so if you look at Nevada, Clinton got all the casino workers organized, all those types of things. It shows why she can move from state to state and be competitive everywhere, and he can't.
Let me read a tweet from Walt. He says, Sanders is leading in all the polls against Republicans. Why do people keep saying Hillary is more electable? Scott, I'm sure you've wrestled with this. What do you say to Walt?
Well, the truth is national polls just mean nothing at this point. We don't have an electorate, or we don't have an election right now that is actually pitting these two people against each other. And so, you're seeing a lot of anti-Trump people just basically saying whoever's running against them, but whether or not that translates into something nationally is an entirely different question. Notice they're picking hypothetical matchups that don't exist, but in concrete matchups, Hillary is beating Bernie in the contest that matters right now, and that's the Democratic primaries and caucuses. Although Bernie had at least one massive win, and I think Hillary is seeking to have that big or bigger win in South Carolina to reclaim the narrative. But you know, the fact is, a lot of the people just aren't that familiar with Bernie Sanders nationally. Yes, those who are passionate about the Democratic primary, those who, you know, listen to your show are simply more informed than the average person. And so anybody who's polled who is not a likely primary voter, but may be deemed a likely general election voter this far out, which is an imprecise science to say the least this far out, you know, they're hearing Donald Trump versus someone else. I'll take the someone else. And that doesn't mean that they know a thing about Bernie Sanders. It really says more about Trump than anything.
John, let me go back to you and throw out the name Marco Rubio, and I'm going to quote some things that Dick Pullman wrote in his piece in the last couple of days about Marco Rubio. Is he the sort of golden boy among the, if I can put it, that is a terrible thing to say, the golden candidate going forward for, you think, the mainstream Republican Party?
Well, I think he has the best chance of winning in November, that's for sure, because what he does is he's certainly acceptable to multiple wings of the Republican Party, if you will. Social conservatives like him, reformers like him. They still see him enough as an outsider, but he's also a great American story as well, and the establishment like him. And so I think he offers the best contrast. I have seen within Republican circles, there's been a number of studies done already that looked at the top three candidates and said, well, how will that affect up and down ballot races, Senate races, congressional races? And what they found was Ted Cruz probably hurts us more than helps us. Trump does okay because he does bring a new voter, but the candidate that actually helps Republicans all the way up and down the ballot, if you will, is Marco Rubio. So I do think you're going to see the anybody but Trump and Cruz coalition quickly unite behind Rubio at this point.
And Dick, you call him a callow freshman senator.
Well, I call him callow in the sense that I don't see what he has in terms of any kind of, you know, measurable achievements. Whether that matters or not, I don't know. You know, he can, like John said, you know, I think he's good at telling a story of his campaign. Narrative is really important for a candidate, particularly in this kind of environment. I think the thing that he might have to worry about is there's another Republican debate. I believe it's Thursday night, believe it or not, everybody. And it'd be very interesting to see how Trump handles him. I think, you know, Trump was mocking him at a recent rally, saying that he was sweating so much standing next to him that he thought he was next to a swimming pool. So who knows what he's going to do with him. I think perhaps one of the dangers is that if all the sort of establishment people and the donors start coalescing around Rubio, which I think is quite likely and is probably already happening, of course, post Jeb, that Trump could use that as a foil and say, well, okay, you see, here's where he's the stalking horse for the party establishment, and use that to his advantage.
Scott, what's interesting, of course, is that Nikki Haley endorsed Marco Rubio, as did Senator Tim Scott. He hasn't yet won officially either a caucus or a primary. Did that help him, even though he didn't win in South Carolina? Did that help him?
Well, let's dispel the notion that Marco Rubio doesn't know what he's doing. He knows exactly what. I'm sorry, I couldn't get through without throwing that one in there.
Fair enough.
Actually, it does, and let me explain why. That's not only an endorsement from the establishment, it's an endorsement from real conservatives. Nikki Haley, in the response to the President Obama's State of the Union address, came across as kind of a moderate. She's not. She is very conservative. She won with Tea Party support. In South Carolina, she's considered extremely conservative. Tim Scott propelled to being the first elected African American to the U.S. Senate from South Carolina ever, and the first African American to the U.S. Senate from South Carolina since Reconstruction. And Trey Gowdy, of course, is the Tea Party favorite Republican who went after Hillary Clinton in the Benghazi hearing. So this not only gives him the veneer of an establishment candidate, it also kind of reinforces his credentials as a conservative, and he is a conservative. If you look at the American Conservative Union scores, Marco Rubio has a lifetime ACU score of 98. Now, Ted Cruz has a lifetime ACU score of 100, American Conservative Union. So those endorsements do help him on two levels.
Let's take a hold on to that thought, Dick, only because we have to take another short break. And again, we are talking about what happened this weekend in South Carolina, the Republican presidential primary. Donald Trump walking away with another win, and the Democratic Nevada caucuses, which Hillary Clinton won. Talking with Scott Huffman, the voice you just heard, also John Brabender and Dick Pullman. And we've got a lot of people that want to join the conversation. That phone number is 1-888-477-9499. You can also send us an email, radiotimes@whyy.org, and tweet us at WHYY Radio Times, and I'll read some of that after this very short break. Stay with us. We'll be right back.